I built this trade from nothing. After you rejected me, I am that same girl, standing before you. This is the kingdom of Ilajeoba. My name is Halima, and this is my story. This is the kingdom of Ilajeoba, before the roads were paved. My father, Baba Rotimi, is a modest yam farmer, and my mother weaves beautiful baskets. I am Halima, and this is our home.
The day King Aderibigbe's council sent Halima home in a borrowed wrapper, laughing behind their hands at a girl who had dared to hope a king might marry beneath his station, none of them imagined that within 20 years, the very palace walls they stood inside would still be standing only because of gold that passed through her hands. Before you go further, understand this is not simply a story about a poor girl who became rich. It is a story about a rejection built on a lie so carefully constructed that even the king himself did not fully understand for many years what his own court had done in his name. Stay with me until the end, because the truth behind Halima's rejection is far stranger and far more dangerous than anyone in that kingdom ever dared to say aloud. And if stories like this one, stories of old kingdoms, quiet revenge, and fortunes built from nothing are the kind that keep you watching until the very last word, then let this be the moment you decide to stay close to this channel, because there are many more tales like hers waiting to be told. In the kingdom of Ilaje-Oba, in the years before the roads were paved and before the great market at Okeide had grown into the sprawling trade center it would eventually become, there lived a girl named Halima in a small farming village 3 days' walk from the palace. She was the daughter of Baba Rotimi, a modest yam farmer known throughout the village not for wealth but for honesty. A man who paid every debt he owed, even when it left his own household with less than it needed. And for a mother, Iya Halima, for the village had long ago stopped calling her by any name but her daughters, the way villages sometimes do with women whose children grow to overshadow them, who wove baskets so fine that traders from neighboring villages would walk half a day simply to purchase them. Halima herself was not, by the standards the palace measured beauty, the most striking girl in the kingdom, but she possessed something rarer than beauty, something the elders of her village would speak of long after she left, a mind that moved faster than her circumstances, an ability to see the value in things other people overlooked entirely. As a child, she had turned scraps of cloth too small for her mother's basket into small pouches that she sold to traveling merchants for coins her family desperately needed. By the time she was 15, she had built, from nothing but sharp observation and relentless patience, a small trade in dried herbs and spices that the women of her village had always grown but never thought to sell beyond their own compounds. It was this reputation, a girl who could turn nothing into something, that eventually reached the ears of King Aderibigbe's palace, though not, as you might expect, through any interest in her trading skill at all. There was a particular incident from her childhood that the elders of her village loved to retell, long after she had grown famous throughout the kingdom, because it seemed, in hindsight, to contain whole of who she would become. When Halima was no older than 9, a severe drought struck the region, and the village's usual grain stores dwindled far faster than anyone had planned for. While the adults debated and worried, unable to agree on how best to ration what remained, young Halima quietly organized the village children into small groups, each responsible for gathering a specific wild plant or root that grew even in the driest months, plants the adults had long dismissed as inedible or beneath notice. Within 2 weeks, working almost entirely without adult direction, the children had supplemented the village's dwindling stores enough to carry several families through the worst of the drought without going hungry. Baba Rotimi would tell this story for years afterward, not with the pride of a father boasting about a clever daughter, but with a kind of quiet astonishment, as though he had witnessed something in his own child he did not fully understand himself. It began, as these things often do, with a chance encounter. King Aderibigbe, still young then, only 3 years into his reign after his father's sudden death, had been traveling incognito through the outer villages of his kingdom, a practice his late father had taught him that a king who never left his palace walls would never truly understand the people he ruled. He had stopped tired and thirsty at a small stall near the edge of Halima's village, and it was Halima herself, not recognizing the quietly dressed traveler before her as anything more than an ordinary merchant passing through, who had offered him water and a portion of roasted corn without asking for payment, noticing simply that he looked like a man who had traveled far and eaten little. They spoke for nearly an hour that afternoon, the king revealing nothing of his true identity, and Halima, with no idea she was speaking to her own ruler, spoke to him with a bluntness she would never have dared use had she known the truth, telling him plainly that the roads connecting the outer villages to the capital were in such poor condition that half the kingdom's harvest rotted before it ever reached a market that would pay a fair price for it, that the tax collectors who passed through her village seemed to take more than the palace could possibly need without giving anything back in return, that a kingdom that did not invest in the roads carrying its own food would eventually starve no matter how grand its palace looked from a distance. King Aderibigbe left that village that evening deeply unsettled, not by anger at her boldness, but by the uncomfortable recognition that a village girl selling herbs from a wooden stall understood the health of his kingdom more clearly than half the advisors who sat beside him every single day at court. He returned to the palace and, against the counsel of nearly everyone around him, announced his intention to formally consider Halima as a potential bride, not his first wife, for tradition and political alliance had already secured that position for a woman named Adaura from a neighboring kingdom's royal house, but as a second wife, a position that, while lower in status, still carried real influence and real royal protection. It was an unprecedented gesture, a king seeking out a farmer's daughter from a village most of his own council had never heard of, and it set into motion a chain of events that would, over the following years, reshape not just Halima's life, but the entire kingdom's fortunes. If you are already sensing that this story is not going to unfold the way you expect, you are right, and I promise you the reason behind what happened next is far more calculated than simple prejudice against a poor girl. Before we continue, go ahead and press that subscribe button now, because the true architect of Halima's rejection is about to reveal himself, and his reasons will surprise you. The chief advisor to King Aderibigbe's court was a man named Chief Balogun, a shrewd and deeply ambitious nobleman who had served the king's late father for over 20 years and had, in the transition to the young king's reign, positioned himself as the most trusted voice in nearly every royal decision. What the court did not widely know, and what Halima herself would not discover for many years, was that Chief Balogun controlled, through a network of relatives and business partners, nearly every major trade route running between the capital and the northern territories, a monopoly worth more than the man's official salary could ever explain. He had built this quiet empire slowly, patiently, over years of positioning loyal family members in key trading posts along roads that carried salt, cloth, and grain towards the capital, taking a hidden percentage of nearly everything that moved through his territory before it ever reached an official market. Chief Balogun understood something about Halima the moment he first heard of her from the returning king's own excited description, that a woman with her particular talent for seeing value where others saw nothing, given royal protection and royal resources, represented the single greatest threat his hidden trading empire had ever faced. a second wife with the king's ear and a trader's mind might within a few short years notice exactly the kind of quiet extraction Chief Balogun had spent 2 decades carefully hiding from the crown's own accounting. He could not openly oppose the king's wish, not without revealing motives that would raise exactly the kind of questions he could not afford anyone asking. So instead, he moved in the shadows. Chief Balogun spent the weeks before Halima's formal presentation to the court quietly, carefully poisoning the well against her, not through outright lies that could be traced back to him, but through subtle, deniable suggestions planted among the other nobles, comments about her family's supposed debts, exaggerated tales of impropriety involving traders who visited her village stall, whispered concerns about what common blood mixed into the royal line might mean for the kingdom's standing among its neighbors. By the time Halima arrived at the palace for her formal presentation, dressed in the finest cloth her family could afford, which was, against the silk and gold of the court, painfully plain, the council had already, primed by weeks of Chief Balogun's careful suggestion, to see poverty and unsuitability in everything about her, regardless of what she actually said or did that day. The presentation itself, What Halima did not know that day, what she would not learn for nearly 15 years, was that King Aderibigbe himself had not agreed to this verdict at all. Chief Balogun, exploiting a young king still finding his footing against a council of experienced, older nobles, had presented the rejection to Aderibigbe as the unanimous, unshakable will of the entire court, warning him privately that overriding it so early in his reign would fatally undermine his authority among the very nobles whose support he needed to govern effectively. He had separately told the assembled court that the king himself had quietly reconsidered and now wished the matter closed without further royal comment. A claim none of the nobles thought to verify directly with the young king they assumed, wrongly, shared their own reservations. 2 lies told to 2 different audiences had combined to produce a single outcome that served exactly one man's interests, while leaving both the king and Halima each believing, separately and incorrectly, that the other had simply changed their mind. Halima returned to her village that week in a humiliation so complete that she did not leave her family's compound for nearly a month. But grief in Halima always transformed quickly into something else, not despair, but a fierce, cold clarity. If the palace saw her as nothing more than a poor village girl, she decided, sitting alone with her mother's basket scattered around her, then she would become something the palace could no longer afford to dismiss. She would not chase a crown that had been offered and taken away by people who had never truly seen her. She would build something of her own instead, something so vast that eventually the palace would have no choice but to come to her. If you think that sounds like an impossible promise for a rejected village girl with no capital and no royal favor, stay with me, because what Halima built over the following 2 decades is exactly the kind of story that reminds us why we started this channel in the first place. Proof that the people the powerful dismiss most easily are often the very people who go on to reshape the world around them. If that kind of story moves you, this is the moment to subscribe, because Halima's rise is only just beginning. Halima's first real breakthrough came less than a year after her rejection, and it came fittingly from the very same instinct that had impressed the king during their first unplanned meeting: her understanding that the kingdom's roads were failing its own farmers. She noticed that traders moving goods along the poorly maintained southern routes lost nearly a third of their perishable cargo to spoilage and damage before ever reaching market, a loss every trader simply accepted as the ordinary cost of doing business. Halima, instead, began organizing small cooperatives among the farmers and traders of her own region, pooling resources to maintain the worst sections of road themselves, rather than waiting for palace attention that never seemed to arrive in the outer villages, and developing simple but effective preservation techniques, clay-lined storage pits, carefully timed harvest and transport schedules, cloth treatments that slowed spoilage, that dramatically reduced the losses her fellow traders had always simply accepted as inevitable. The early years were not easy ones, and Halima herself never allowed the later grandeur of her success to erase the genuine hardship of that beginning. There were seasons when her cooperative's careful planning still could not fully protect against a poor harvest, when she went without proper meals for weeks so that the small profits could be reinvested rather than spent on her own comfort, when established traders twice her age refused to deal with her at all, simply because she was a young, unmarried woman operating outside the traditional structures of family-run trade. She persisted through a combination of stubbornness and a genuinely rare gift for identifying which risks were worth taking and which were simply recklessness dressed up as ambition, a distinction that separated her over time from the many other ambitious traders of her generation who burnt brightly for a season or two before collapsing under debts they had not calculated carefully enough to survive. Within 3 years, Halima's cooperative had grown from a handful of village farmers into a trading network spanning nearly a dozen villages across the southern region, and she had earned a reputation, quietly at first and then with growing volume, as a trader whose goods arrived reliably, whose prices were fair, and whose word, unlike so many merchants who cut corners when no one was watching, could always be trusted completely. It was this reputation, more than any single clever trade, that became the true foundation of everything she would eventually build, because in a kingdom where trust between traders was scarce and often costly to verify, Halima's name alone began to function in a kind of currency in itself. Her expansion into the northern trade routes, the very territory Chief Balogun had spent decades quietly controlling, began almost accidentally around her 6th year of trading, when a northern cloth merchant, frustrated by the exploitative terms Chief Balogun's network had long imposed on smaller traders who had no alternative route to market, approached Halima directly, having heard of her reputation for fairness, and asked if her southern network might be willing to open an alternative route north. Halima recognized immediately, with the same sharp instinct that had impressed a young king over roasted corn, exactly what she was being offered. Not simply a new trading partner, but a chance to break a monopoly that, though she did not know its exact history, had been quietly extracting wealth from ordinary traders for over 2 decades. She moved carefully, understanding that a direct challenge to Chief Balogun's network would invite retaliation she was not yet strong enough to survive. Instead, she built her alternative northern route slowly, village by village, trader by trader, offering terms so consistently fair, lower fees, transparent pricing, genuine investment in the roads and storage facilities that benefited every trader using them, not just herself, that within 4 years, nearly half the northern trade that had once flowed exclusively through Chief Balogun's controlled posts had shifted toward Halima's growing network instead, drawn not by force or politics, but simply by traders choosing, freely, the merchant who treated them most fairly. Chief Balogun, watching his hidden empire erode piece by piece over those years, grew increasingly desperate, and it was in his desperation that the first real threads connecting Halima's old rejection to his own hidden ambitions finally began to surface. He attempted on 3 separate occasions that Halima would only fully piece together years later to sabotage her growing network, bribing officials to delay her caravans at checkpoints under false pretenses, spreading rumors among northern traders questioning her honesty, using the exact same whispering tactics that once poisoned the court against her, even in his most desperate attempt, attempting to have a rival merchant falsely accuse Halima's operation of tax evasion before the regional magistrate. each attempt failed, not because Halima possessed some special protection, but because the trust she had built so patiently over years of consistently fair dealing proved far steadier than Chief Balogun's manufactured suspicions. Traders who had done business with Halima for years simply did not believe the rumors, having seen her honesty proven, transaction after transaction, in ways that Chief Balogun's carefully worded whispers could not undo. By her 12th year of trading, Halima's network had grown into something no single merchant in the kingdom's history had ever built, a trading empire spanning both the southern and northern territories, employing directly and indirectly thousands of farmers, weavers, porters and smaller traders across dozens of villages, with warehouses in 3 major market towns and a reputation for fair dealing so strong that foreign merchants from beyond the kingdom's borders began to seek her out specifically, preferring her terms over those of the palace's own official trading houses. Her wealth by this point had grown to a scale that made her, by any practical measure, the richest individual in the entire kingdom, king included, whose royal treasury depended heavily on taxes collected from trade routes that increasingly ran through networks she herself had built. She had by then also become something else entirely, something the elders of her own home village found almost impossible to reconcile with the modest girl who had once sold herbs from a small wooden stall, a mentor and benefactor to dozens of young women across the villages her network touched, many of whom she personally trained in the exact trading principles that built her own fortune, believing with real conviction that a network built entirely around her own singular success would eventually prove fragile in ways a network of many capable, independent-minded traders never would. Several of these young women would go on to build significant trading operations of their own under Halima's early mentorship, a legacy that by the time of her death many years later had produced an entire generation of women traders across the kingdom's southern and northern territories who traced their own beginnings directly back to lessons first learned at Halima's side. It was around this time, in her 13th year of trading, that the truth about her long-ago rejection finally began to unravel. And it happened, appropriately enough, through the very trade networks she had spent over a decade.
Those years, slowly building a case so thoroughly documented that it could not be easily waved away as mere rumor or personal grievance. She finally brought her evidence not directly to the court, where Chief Balogun's influence remained strong, but to King Aderibigbe himself, now a mature ruler nearly 2 decades into his reign, requesting a private audience through official channels available to any citizen of sufficient standing. An audience that her wealth and reputation, ironically, now made almost impossible for the palace to refuse. When she stood before the king again, 15 years after that humiliating presentation, she was no longer a nervous village girl in borrowed cloth, but a woman whose trading empire funded, through taxes and tariffs alone, a significant portion of the very treasury that kept his kingdom running. The conversation between Halima and King Aderibigbe that day has been recounted many different ways over the years, each version shaped by whoever happened to be telling it, but the core of what passed between them remained consistent across every account. The king, presented with evidence he could not dismiss, sat in stunned, painful silence for a long while before speaking. And when he finally did speak, it was not the anger Halima had half expected, but something closer to grief. He told her, with what she would later describe as genuine anguish, that he had spent 15 years believing she had simply changed her own mind about him, had assumed in the private way people sometimes protect themselves from painful truths, that whatever brief connection they had shared over roasted corn on a dusty road had simply not been strong enough on her end to survive the reality of court politics. He had never once suspected that the woman he remembered so vividly had been told in his own name a lie designed entirely to protect one ambitious advisor's hidden fortune. He told her, too, something Halima had not expected to hear, something that finally answered the small nagging observation her own mother had made all those years earlier on their long walk home from the palace. He had, in fact, quietly inquired about her several times over the years that followed her rejection. Careful, indirect inquiries made through trusted intermediaries rather than open investigation, afraid of what it might mean for a king to be seen chasing after a match his own counsel had firmly rejected. Each time, he told her, the answers that came back to him had been carefully managed, filtered through channels Chief Balogun had, unbeknownst to the king, quietly controlled. Reports describing a girl who had, apparently, moved on entirely, shown no further interest in the palace, built a life that no longer had any room in it for a king who had let her go so easily. Halima realized, hearing this, that Chief Balogun's deception had not ended with a single rejection 15 years earlier, but had continued in smaller and quieter ways for years afterward, a long campaign of carefully managed lies designed to ensure neither party ever discovered how completely they had each been misled about the other. Chief Balogun, confronted with Halima's carefully assembled evidence before a full council convened at the king's furious command, did not survive the reckoning that followed. Stripped of his titles, his hidden trading empire dismantled, and its assets returned to the crown, he was exiled from the kingdom entirely. His decades of quiet extraction finally, publicly exposed to the very nobles who once had trusted him completely. It was, by any measure, a complete and thorough downfall, though Halima herself, when asked years later how it felt to finally witness her betrayer's punishment, admitted that the satisfaction she had once imagined feeling arrived in reality strangely muted, overshadowed by the much larger question that now sat unresolved between herself and the king. Here is where I think this story becomes something more interesting than a simple tale of revenge finally served. Because what happened next was not the fairy tale you might expect, and I think that makes it truer and more worth telling than a simpler story would have been. King Aderibigbe, in the difficult months following Chief Balogun's exposure, formally reopened the question of marriage, offering Halima, now the wealthiest and most influential individual in the kingdom, the position that had been stolen from her 15 years earlier. It would have been, by every traditional measure, a triumphant and fitting conclusion, the rejected village girl finally claiming the crown that had been once denied her through deceit. But Halima, sitting across from the king in the same private audience chamber where the truth was first revealed, gave an answer that surprised nearly everyone who eventually heard the story, including, by his own later admission, the king. She declined. Not out of lingering anger, she explained carefully, and not because she doubted the sincerity of what the king now offered her. But 15 years had changed her in ways that could not simply be undone by a wrong finally righted. She had built, from nothing but her own mind and her own patience, something that belonged entirely to her, not granted by royal favor, not dependent on any man's protection, but earned through 2 decades of her own labor and judgment. She had come to value that independence, she told him, in a way that even a genuine, freely offered royal marriage could not fully replace, because a crown, however sincerely given now, would always exist within a court structure that once decided her worth based on the poverty of her birth, rather than the strength of her mind. A structure she was no longer certain she wished to be formally bound inside, however much its highest position was now at last honestly hers to claim.
What she proposed instead, and what King Aderibigbe ultimately, after some reflection, accepted, was a different kind of partnership entirely. Not a royal marriage, but a formal alliance between the crown and her trading network, with Halima retaining full independent control over her own empire, while working alongside the palace as an advisor and investor whose input, like 15 years earlier, could never again be dismissed or manipulated by a hidden court conspiracy. Over the following years, this partnership would fund the paving of the very southern roads Halima once complained about to an anonymous traveler she did not know was her king, would build proper storage facilities in every major market town across the kingdom, would establish a fairer, more transparent structure for smaller traders that made Chief Balogun's old style of hidden extraction structurally impossible to ever quietly rebuild. By the time Halima passed her network on to her chosen successors, decades later, roughly half of the kingdom's roads, bridges, wells, and market infrastructure had been funded directly or indirectly through the wealth of the woman a corrupt advisor had once dismissed as too poor to matter. The formal charter establishing this partnership, drafted jointly by Halima's own trusted advisors and the palace's chief scribe, contained a provision that Halima herself insisted upon above all others, one that reflected everything her own painful history had taught her about how easily power could be quietly abused when no one was watching closely enough. Every major infrastructure project funded through the partnership would be reviewed publicly, its accounts open to inspection by any citizen who wished to examine them, a transparency measure so unusual for its time that several older nobles privately grumbled it was beneath the dignity of royal business to conduct itself so openly. Halima held firm on this point, telling the king plainly that she had watched one man hide 2 decades of quiet theft behind exactly the kind of closed-door secrecy the nobles now wished to preserve, and she would not spend her own hard-won fortune helping to rebuild a system that could simply produce another Chief Balogun a generation later. Halima never married King Aderibigbe, and the two of them, by every account passed down through the years, remained something more than strangers or lovers, genuine friends and equal partners, bound not by royal ceremony, but by a mutual, hard-won respect neither of them had expected to find on that dusty road so many years ago. She married eventually, much later in life, a fellow trader named Ige, who had worked alongside her for over a decade before either of them acknowledged what had grown quietly between them, a partnership built fittingly on the exact same foundation of trust and mutual respect that had defined every successful venture of Halima's remarkable life. Ige had joined her network originally as an ordinary potter, rising through the years through nothing but demonstrated competence and integrity, exactly the kind of quiet meritocracy Halima had built her entire empire around. And it pleased her greatly, she would later tell close friends, that her own marriage had come not from royal decree or family arrangement, but from the same patient earned trust that had built everything else she valued in her life. Their marriage produced no royal title, no grand ceremony attended by kings and nobles, only a modest celebration among the traders, farmers, and villages who had built Halima's fortune alongside her. A celebration she would later say meant more